So, have you ever been playing like a video game and saw one of these types of cutscenes, like this one or this one, and thought, oh man, those are so pretty, I wish I knew how to do those? Well, let me tell you, I don't know either. Okay, well, I don't know how they do it, but I have made things like this one or even this one before. And while they're much simpler and on a completely different level than the professional ones, I have learned a thing or two about them and thought, hey, I know enough to share it with the world, and maybe someone else will find it useful and try it themselves and see how that goes. So that's what we're doing here. I'm gonna teach you how to animate your illustrations. Also, hi, face reveal. I'm trying out something new. We'll see if it sticks. Anyways, let's go. Oh, before I forget, one more thing. You will need two software for this. One, your main drawing software. I use Krita, but really you can use anything that has layers. And 3D animation software. I use Blender because it's free and I'm a cheap bitch, but you can do whatever you prefer. Point number one, the illustration. So while technically you can use this technique to animate any illustration you've done previously, I like to prepare specific ones with the animation process in mind because I find it easier than to animate it. Mostly before you start the animation, you need to know what you want to animate. You don't have to know the exact composition or anything, but like keep in mind what parts you want to move later on. For starters, I would recommend things like trees, fabric, or mostly trees and fabric, actually. Those are the easiest parts. You can later on learn how to animate eye movement, mouth movement, the whole body moving, but they are a bit more complicated, and if you're doing it for the first time, you might get discouraged. In this case, I'm drawing Genshin fan art, not surprisingly. Because I like to make live wallpaper for every main. Either way. Now there's two ways you can approach this type of illustration. One, where you finish the drawing normally, you save it, and then you have like the flat image, and only then you go and separate the moving parts and what you will animate and what will stay static. And the other way is keeping that in mind since the beginning and basically drawing every item that will be animated separately on a separate layer. I tried out both techniques and they both work for different things. I prefer to finish my illustrations first and later on animate them because I work in a more painterly style and mostly use one layer, so it complicates things when I have to paint every aspect on its own layer. But for example, if you use line art or have a different technique and are used to working with a lot of layers, that the way to separate everything will be simpler for you and you might find it more useful and less agonizing. Either way, sooner or later you will have to separate them, you just have to find out which, at what point of the drawing process you would like to do so. And in that in mind, you can finish the drawing like you would normally do. In my case, this is the finished illustration. I hope you like it. I like it quite a lot. Now onto the second step, the separating part. Obviously, you don't have to do this one if you already separated it while drawing, but here's a few tips and tricks of what I realized is useful and how to basically clean up your separated parts. You will have to separate the parts that will be static from the parts that will be moving, and then all of the moving parts, separate them individually, like the front of the bangs, the side of the bangs, a longer piece of the hair, all of that has to be separately. So yeah, basically what you take the illustration, you select the layer, the part that you want to separate, you copy and paste it onto a new layer, and then you have to draw over the blank space that was basically cut out from the first image, because, well, if we animate that part and, for example, move it forward or up, you will see the spot below it, technically, and you have to make sure it looks good, so you will paint it over. And that's basically what I'm doing here. I am selecting the different parts that I will be animating and covering the blank spots that they left behind. And at the end, your finished illustration should technically look the same at first glance, but then when you look at the layer like mode, each part is separate. Also, I recommend naming them accordingly, because this process can get quite confusing, and it's a bit simpler if you have things named correctly. At the end, these were my static layers, the ones that I will not be animating, and these were all of the elements that I will animate. It might seem like a lot, it's not, I promise you. It gets accumulated very quickly. Obviously, the first time you do it, you can try something simpler. I didn't listen to that. I made it very complicated my first time and I almost gave up, so I recommend going with something simpler. Now, when you have all of your elements separated and everything, we can move on to the actual animating part. Well, technically we're not gonna be animating it, we're gonna be transforming the layers. And for that we need to move on to our animation software / 3D modeling one. Again, I'm going to be using Blender, and I'm also not a Blender expert, I use it for very basic things, so I'm gonna explain it in the simplest terms, and I'm sorry for anyone who knows how to use Blender, because this might be painful to you. I'm sorry, I don't know the terminology, I just click the buttons that I'm used to clicking. So, we open Blender, we're gonna delete this square, and then click 1 and go into front view, and then click this shortcut to set up the camera to that point of view. Even though this is a 3D software, we're gonna be using it like it's a 2D software. And to add your images, your layers that we will be working with, you need to first enable the add image as planes. I think that's what it's called, add-on. It's here. You don't have to download anything, it's just built into Blender, you have to enable it, and then click add image / sequence, I think, and then image as planes. Select all of your individual layers that we just separated from the drawing and import them. Also, during the process, also click this button to make sure they are not affected by lighting, because that would make it way complicated, and I haven't yet figured out how to play with lighting in these ones. They will import as a lot of blank planes in one line, do not worry. While you have all of them selected, click Shift S and then select it to cursor, and they should all get piled up back to the original shape of your drawing. Then go into this tab and change the resolution of the final render to the resolution of your drawing, and then scale up all of your selected parts to that border to make sure it fills up the whole thing while we're rendering it, because the program for now doesn't know that it's going to only render the images. It thinks we're gonna render a whole 3D environment, and we're not gonna do that. This is 2D animating. Basically, we're tricking this program into doing 2D animation instead of 3D modeling. And you might be worried, because instead of your drawings, your drawing just appears as a blank gray layer. Don't worry, just click this button on top and your drawing should appear. Mostly. The thing is, what we are doing is basically adding a lot of planes, just squares, basically, with the texture of our drawings on top of it. And that's important to know, that the parts of our drawing right now are just textures, and we're working with these giant squares. And basically we're gonna have to first of all control the squares, and only because of the texture we added on them, it's gonna look like we're animating the actual drawing. I hope this makes sense. You might be worried because some of the layers are messed up. That's because all of the planes are currently sitting in the same position on the x-axis, basically. They're all on the same position, and the computer doesn't know which textures should go on top of each other. So you have to find this little box on the individual planes, and if you want one of the elements to be in front of the other ones, for example, let's say the main body of the character in this piece, I want it to be on top of the sleeve pieces and the background, I just move it by like 0.001 centimeters in front for the computer to know that that one will be slightly in front, but not to make a big enough difference for the image later on not to add up. And basically, with different elements, I move them by 0.001, 0.002, and so on, until they're basically in the same order as they should be in the final illustration. It's not the perfect system, but it's what I works the best for me, and it doesn't disrupt the final render, because the difference between the planes is so little that the textures still align. And when we have all of them in order, and basically your camera view should just show what looks like your starting illustration, you might think this is the part where we start animating and things. No, not yet. Here's the final step. As I explained before, what we're working with right now are these giant squares planes, the shape of your original illustration canvas, with just the tiny textures in the middle. And here's the problem. If we went right now, rigged the giant squares and tried to transform them, the area that we would be transforming would be so big that the actual transformation would not be seen, would be too small, or would be incorrect. So what we have to do is size down those squares to basically the shape of our original drawing. And how we do that is we click on one layer. For example, I use this one. We go into edit mode, and then left click and click the subdivide one on the bottom of the page. I turn it up to 10. And then you might see that the giant square turned into smaller squares. That's because we basically just subdivided the plane into smaller ones that are all connected. And then I go and select all of the squares that have nothing to do with the texture and make sure they're not at all touching the texture, and delete them. And when you have a smaller surface, you select it one more time, click subdivide again, and go up to like 6-7 times. The more the better, but also your computer might slow down if you're doing a big illustration, and like a 6 is a good number from my experience. And then once again go and delete all of the squares that are not touching the texture. And then you should have what looks like still the same texture, and the illustration should technically not change, but your actual, like the hidden plane that we are actually working with, is much smaller and much more accurate to the shape of your texture. And then we basically go with every animated texture and we do the same thing. You don't have to do those with the static layers, basically the ones we're not going to be animating, because we're not going to be animating them. It doesn't matter what the surface is. And you just go through all of the layers and you basically clean them up. What it should look like is, for example, this texture has this plane and this texture has this kind of plane. So now that we have finished all of the actual compressing part and preparation, we can finally get into rigging. And for that we're gonna, use armatures, which are basically bones. We're treating... some of you might know how 3D animation works. That's what we're doing here. We're basically animating these 2D planes as 3D objects, because again, 3D software. We click Shift A, armature, then this small little shape should appear. That's your bone. This is the start of it, this is the finish of it. And then we basically take it, grab it, and scale it down to the object that it will correspond to is. And some objects might be simple enough that they only need one armature piece. For example, these bracelets, I only used one of them. But some, like for example this tree, I used up to 3 ones, and for that you will go to edit mode, click on the smaller ball at the end of the armature, click E and extend it however many times you need it. And basically we're making one bone for every moving element. Then to attach the bone to said element, you go back into the object view, click first the texture of the tree, then the armature that corresponds to the tree, for example, and then you left click on parent, and then with automatic weights. To make sure that they connected correctly, you click on the armature, you go into pose mode, and if you move around the armature, the texture should move along with it. That way you know that it's rigged correctly. And we basically go with this for every moving element. At the end, it should look something like this. In the layers folder, it will look something like this. If you open it, you will see the individual bone elements and the drawing. We're gonna be using 24 frames a second, standard for animation. Just multiply however many seconds you want the animation to be by that many frames. I used 250 because that was the opening one and it's like 10 seconds. And it's fine for these kind of animations, especially if you're doing live wallpapers for TikTok. And now we can hide most of the armatures and just focus on the one we're going to be animating first. And what you do is, well, if you know anything about animation, we're going to use keyframes. You create one keyframe at the beginning and then you copy it and create one at the ending in case you want the drawing to loop. If you don't need the animation to loop, you don't need to do that element. But I like mine to do that because I think it looks nicer, although I have not yet succeeded with doing it perfectly because this process will go slightly incorrect. You don't have to create every keyframe because the computer is smart enough to create in-betweens. You just have to create the instances where you want kind of like the extremes. For example, first I want to move this part up. I'm gonna create a keyframe that is the highest point of that movement, and then in between I don't have to do anything. The computer will move the branch from that position to the next one, like in 3D animation. And then you create a bunch of keyframes. You change the rotation however you want it. Again, remember we are working on 2D, so you don't have to rotate it in all directions, you just have to move it across one axis, the green one in this case. When you're satisfied with the movement of that specific part, whichever part the armature corresponds to, you can hide that armature, click on the you can unhide the next one and work on that one, basically repeating the steps, creating keyframes at the beginning, at the end, and then in between wherever you want the most extreme parts of the movement to be. Later on, you could do more complicated armatures, for example, how I did in this piece, where I had the body of the character move first, and then all of the other elements that were rigged were moving along with the body, plus they had their own movement, but I think that's more complicated and it needs its own tutorial. If you want to learn how to do that, just let me know, I might do one in the future. This part you basically just have to feel out the animation. Sometimes you will make it a bit too fast, sometimes you will make it a bit too slow, and you just have to kind of pinpoint where the extremes will be. At the end, you will have to export it. You can either export first as images and then go to a video sequencer and animate it there, or you can export it automatically as an FFmpeg video. I think that's what it's called. I'm not sure. Again, whole other video. Basically, just find a way you want to export it, and at the end, this should be the final result. I hope you enjoyed this journey. I hope you might have learned something, even though my explaining is not the best in the world. I'm glad I'm back on this channel. Honestly, I miss doing videos, and let me know what you think. Again, I said it previously, but I'm always very awkward with doing voiceovers and I don't feel comfortable with them, mostly because I'm a very animated person and it makes me uncomfortable when I know people can't see my movements, because that's how I explain a lot of the things I can't really explain with my words, because I'm not the best at speaking, let's be honest. so this made me way more comfortable. Also, if you want to support me, you can go to my imprint shop where you can buy some of my illustrations and prints. For example, the one in this video, it's already available. And if you want to see more of my artworks, go onto my Instagram. Also, if you want to set up this illustration, well, animation as your live wallpaper, you can find me on TikTok. And also technically Tumblr, but that's just me posting about gay pirates for the past 3 months. If you're interested in that, highly recommend. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I get to see you next time. Bye!